My intention here is just to give you a very brief overview of the metrology hierarchy and sort of how the CCRI and the National Metrology Institutes and the designated institutes fit into everything that we've been talking about so far today. So this sort of leads into the next several talks that include most of tomorrow morning. That will generally deal with the metrology side of things, and in particular, primary, secondary standards, how those get distributed, and how we maintain and, in the first place, establish traceability for radioactivity measurements in nuclear medicine. So I like to show this slide whenever I give this type of presentation. And what it does is it sort of gives us what the end goal of a lot of the work that we do is. And on the left-hand side, we'll see that the workflow for having a patient come to you and get diagnosed and a treatment plan come up, be developed, and then patient undergoes the series of treatments, there's follow-up, and all that type of stuff. On the left-hand side, you can see that that's primarily a set of radioactivity measurements. And ideally, what we want to be able to do is establish a relationship between an injected dosage that you give and the dose that's actually imparted to the different tissues, and relate that to an observed clinical outcome. And we maintain, at least from the metrology standpoint, that the only way that you can do that is if all of your measurements that you're making, both on the activity side and on the dosimetry side, are related to fundamental quantities. And if you're able to do that, then you can actually have some validation in your organ dose calculations, whether it's through a model or maybe someday we'll actually get in vivo dosimetry and be able to measure these type of things in live patients. But in the meantime, we have to come up with a way of being able to use a surrogate value. And right now, that's activity measurements. And so the accurate absorbed dose estimates start with an accurate radioactivity measurement. And in order to do that, I maintain, and I think a lot of the metrologists in the room will agree, that requires calibrations that are traceable to national standards. So the reason why we do precision measurements of activity in radiotherapy are to ensure, for example, when we're doing imaging studies that are monitoring the course of treatment on a patient, that all of those images are based on the same relative activity measurements, or that we can relate all of the imaging data to a common standard, whether that's different scanners that are used, a patient gets imaged in different clinical sites, or even different manufacturers, that a becquerel per ml in an image taken in one place for the same patient is equal to that same quantity taken with another scanner, for example. It ensures that the dosages are being administered to the patients in the first place are accurate and reproducible, and provides, especially for model development, when you're validating new imaging techniques, or when you're trying to compare different radiopharmaceuticals in a clinical trial, it actually provides a ground truth for your measurements. And then finally, if you're able to trace those or correlate those to a traceable dose measurement, it allows a true dose-response relationship to be established, and that eventually leads to real personalized dosimetry. So we're going to talk about a definition right now. We've thrown the term around a couple times today, but getting down to what exactly do we mean when we talk about traceability? And the definition in the International Vocabulary of Metrology defines it as a property of a measurement result where the result can be related to a reference through a documented unbroken chain of calibrations, each contributing to the measurement uncertainty. And so there's three key components to this that have to be kept in mind. The first is that you have an unbroken chain of comparisons or calibrations back to a primary standard. And by a primary standard, we're talking about a realization of a particular SI unit. In our case, for activity measurements, we're talking about the becquerel. An uncertainty assessment is a critical component of having traceability. If you're not able to assess the uncertainty at each step in your traceability chain, you don't have a valid traceability chain. And then it's a property of a measurement, not a laboratory and instrument. So one of the colloquialisms that we use a lot is that we have a traceable source. Well, there's no such thing as a traceable source. You have a source where the activity measurement is traceable to a standard. Likewise, you don't have a traceable instrument. So you make these chain of comparisons and at different levels in clinical practice. You know, we go from the definition of a fundamental unit, and we realize that through a primary standard, and we link that to secondary standards. And I'm going to define some of these terms later. And then that leads to working standards. And every time you make a comparison to these, to one measurement to another, back to the original fundamental unit, you're adding on uncertainty. And on the left-hand side, you see what we've typically seen for a primary standard, a National Metrology Institute or a designated institute would typically have a measurement uncertainty of about 1%, a standard uncertainty of 1%. And then at the secondary standard laboratory, or at the secondary standard level, and at the working standard level, that typically adds a factor of 3 to the uncertainty, depending on the technique and depending on the capabilities of the laboratory. And then you get further down the chain, and by the time, and this isn't true of all cases, but we've seen this in several cases over the last couple of decades, that by the time you get to the end user, even though you've started off with a 1% uncertainty with a primary standard, you're talking about a 5 to 10% uncertainty in your activity measurement at the clinical level, just because of the additional factors that are going into making that comparison against one source to another. So the question is, okay, you have this definition of the fundamental unit. Where does that come from? Well, it comes from right here. So the meter convention is the agreement that basically defines all of the fundamental units that are used around the world. And we heard a little bit about this in Vincent's introduction, that the meter convention was established in 1875. Originally, 17 states were signatories to it. And now it consists of 64 member states and 36 associate states and economies. The meter convention is administered primarily through the General Conference on Weights and Measures, and that's composed of the member state representatives that meet every 4 years. And they basically are the body that decides how the different units are defined. And you may have heard that there was a redefinition of the SI a couple of years ago, and that was generally decided on by that body. And then the actual workings of how this gets administered is done through the International Committee on Weights and Measures, and that's a set of individuals from different countries that are appointed by the CGPM. And the actual real work gets done here at the BIPM, both in providing the technical and logistical support for the consultative committees, as well as the consultative committees themselves. So the BIPM, the International Committee on Weights and Measures, was formed in 1875 specifically to administer the meter convention. And we heard this morning that there are several consultative committees of the BIPM that basically consult on the definition of different physical quantities. And the one that we're interested in, of course, is CCRI, which is responsible for the definitions for the physical quantities related to ionizing radiation. The BIPM also serves as a liaison between the National Metrology Institutes and the DIs, the designated institutes, as well as the regional metrology organizations and several inter and non-governmental organizations. And some of those intergovernmental and non-governmental organizations would, for example, be the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, the WHO, World Trade Organization, and many others. So what this does is it forms a hierarchy of measurements that could be seen. At the very top would be the BIPM, and they interact with the National Metrology Institutes, and then the National Metrology Institutes interact with the secondary standards calibration laboratories or source suppliers, and then finally, in an ideal world, they would interact directly with the end users and the clinical researchers. Depending on the region and depending on the country, these interactions happen either on a regular basis or happen on an irregular format. So the Consultative Committee for Ionizing Radiation at the BIPM was originally formed in 1958 and encompassed all of the radiation measurements, so neutrons, dosimetry, and radioactivity. And that was eventually divided into 3 sections that we heard about this morning, with CCRI 1 dealing with radiation dosimetry, CCRI Section 2 dealing with the measurement of radioactivity, and Section 3 dealing with the measurement of neutrons. And within the CCRI, these tests are carried out by 10 different working groups. And one of those working groups is the Radionuclide Therapy and Quantitative Imaging Working Group. This working group was formed in late 2019, specifically to be able to enable the CCRI to find out where radionuclide and dosimetry metrology can improve the effectiveness of radiopharmaceutical therapy. It was meant to coordinate the activities to address this, especially in the areas of quantitative imaging and patient dosimetry. And the idea is you're bringing together international experts from the field of metrology and radionuclide therapy to understand where metrology can impact the effectiveness of radionuclide-based therapy. And we're one of, in terms of consultative committees and working groups of the consultative committees, we're pretty unique in that the composition of the experts that are in the working group come from outside of metrology and come from outside of the National Metrology Institutes. We have quite a few clinical practitioners that are part of the working group. And that makes sure that the work of the working group is actually relevant to what's being done in the clinic. Originally, the idea was to include dosimetry as well. And in fact, there are representatives from the dosimetry community on the working group. But in one of the very first meetings that we had, it was determined that the measurement of dose due to radionuclides is still fairly immature and is not at a point where the National Metrology Institutes or the BIPM would have a role yet. And so the immediate impact was determined to be mostly the radioactivity measurements. And that's what we've been focusing on since the working group was formed. So our short-term plan, we first started having formal meetings in 2020, just as the pandemic hit. We've yet to meet live in person. All of our work so far has been online, with the exception of this particular working group in this workshop. So our plan, we're providing advice to the NMIs and DIs on what standards are needed to enhance practice. And part of that is through getting information through venues such as this working group. We propose new comparison exercise in order to validate claimed competencies that includes comparisons that we're going to be doing for radionuclides, as well as develop mechanisms for being able to do unique geometries such as phantoms, for example. How would we go about doing a comparison between national metrology institutes that that provide calibrated phantoms, for example? And then another major area that we're involved with right now is the development of best practice guides. Developing measurement capabilities, not just in the national metrology institutes, but also at the clinical level as well. And then also best practices for running comparison exercises between clinics as well as the metrology laboratories. And then we're building links with appropriate stakeholders and reporting the findings to the CCRI sections and finding gaps where metrology, particularly in radionuclide metrology and radiation dosimetry, can help advance the field. So some of the things that we've actually accomplished since forming the working group, we've had, I think, 6 to 8 virtual meetings, doing a lot of planning. We've held 3 webinars so far. One in May of 2021, January 2022, and fall of 2023. And all of these have all been geared towards, actually, I have the date wrong on that last one, the fall of 2023. This should be the beginning of 2024 for this alpha emitting workshop. But the whole idea is to bring together both the NMIs and the clinical communities. We've been interacting more with the professional societies, in particular the Society of Nuclear Medicine and Molecular Imaging, the EANM, BIPM, et cetera. And the big thing right now, in addition to planning this workshop, has been the good practice documents. The first one is guidance on traceability and establishment of secondary standards laboratories that we started about 8 months ago. That's still in progress. We've sort of been on hiatus while we've been planning this workshop, but we'll be returning to that work shortly after the workshop's over. And then providing guidance on measurement issues associated with targeted alpha therapy. And that's particularly what this workshop is for, to give guidance and input onto what topics we should be including in that document. So finally, the last 2 slides that I have, one of the questions that came up earlier was about recognizing the standards that were the examples that were given were NIST and PTB. And I alluded to the fact that there's already an agreement in place that that sort of assists with that. And I'm not going to go to too many details about this. You can look it all up online at the BIPM website. But we have an agreement called the Mutual Recognition Arrangement of the CIPM that was established in 1999 to provide the technical basis for this recognition between national measurement standards and the acceptance of one laboratory's certificates by another. There's 250 signatories that include 97 NMIs, 149 DIs, and then 4 international organizations. And from a practical standpoint, what this does is that it enables an NMI standard to be recognized and applied internationally, even in countries where you don't have an NMI. But an important key of this is that each laboratory's quality management system is important for demonstrating how that traceability chain is maintained and established. And one of the ways that we do this, and this is just a lead in to our next talk, is that it requires, amongst other things, demonstration of equivalence of standards in order for the whole process to work. And this is done through participation in comparison exercises, whether they're organized through the BIPM or whether they're done on a relatively informal basis bilaterally by individual laboratories. So this just shows the example of one particular comparison that the next speaker is probably going to go through much more detail. But at this point, hope that that just served as an overview of the national metrology, or the metrology infrastructure that we have in place to help address some of the issues that we've been talking about all day so far. And hopefully this will form the basis for all the rest of the discussions that we're going to have, both especially tomorrow morning with the discussion of primary and secondary standards. So with that, I'll thank you for your attention and take any questions.